Hello. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Guy. So we heard a lot about clients and about various challenges in the client space. It probably comes as no surprise that those clients talk to servers, and Netflix operate pretty massive infrastructure on the server side. To give you some idea of our scale, we operate about 150 instances. Instances refer to AWS VMs. 150 instances at peak globally. We're in multiple regions. About a third of this footprint is our data tier. We cannot autoscale that. About 2/3 are stateless or supposedly stateless services that could be autoscaled, and we do scale them. So we realize roughly 30% savings from autoscaling, which translates in about 30,000 instances, right there. So you might think, well, 30,000 instances is not a lot, but it actually, we can make a good use of it. So why do we scale? One reason is more on the philosophical side, is the data center versus AWS cloud or whatever cloud provider you're in. Cloud supposed to be elastic, take only what you need, don't take more, there is no budgets, there is no, if you don't use it, you lose it, kind of data center mentality, and we wanted to encourage our service teams, our developers, to follow this paradigm. And there is another reason, very pragmatical reason. Well, there is a lot of cash here. We can save money, very real money, actually. Netflix use reserved instances. We pre-purchase capacity. AWS allows you to do this. So the money, we have the capacity. But we can repurpose unused capacity, those 30K instances, for a lot of things. Encoding is one of the most obvious use of that unused capacity or saved capacity. We can run encoding in small chunks during off-peak hours, during our trough hours. We can do this over a period of a few days. Usually there is a pipeline, there's a schedule of encoding. So we don't have to have any extra capacity. By the way, a couple of years ago, or a year and a half, our encoding team published a blog about it. I encourage you to read it. It's a very interesting blog. Pre-compute. We spend a lot of time and compute resources generating recommendations. That's Netflix secret sauce. So we take it very seriously. And we found a way of running pre-compute, again, during night hours, when we can realize gains from that unused capacity. Failover and red black are a little bit more involved concepts. Autoscaling allows us to fail over more efficiently. We do not have to provision a lot of capacity. We do not have to provision the full capacity in every region for failover. And red blacks, if we push early in the morning when our server groups are not at their peak size, we can save on failover, on red black as well. Last point, the one before last, curing cancer, our very own Guy Serino, last year, a few months ago actually, right? Yeah, there was a Hack Day project. We used our trough capacity to join Cure in the Box. It was a Hack Day project. It was successful. Guy says yes.
There's still cancer. We're working.
Right, unfortunately. Guy can tell you cancer in Russian, by the way. Ask him. Should you autoscale? Well, my answer is yes, you should, and you can get the same benefits that we get. If you're running in, say, Google Cloud, or if you're running on demand in AWS, that autoscaling translates into dollars. It's money. It's money on the table. If you're using pre-purchased capacity, then you can repurpose this capacity for something else, something useful, just as we did. And there is a word of caution. So autoscaling is something that you can apply for each server group or ASG individually. And there is certain things that you should be aware of before you just start autoscaling everything. All kinds of irregularities in traffic, bursty, sticky, uneven distribution of traffic across zones or individual instances, they usually do not play so well with autoscaling. You can probably work around it, but that's not, I guess, the normal use case. Small ASG sizes, we found that it's not worth bothering scaling those because each scale event, if you're less than 10, each scale event is more than 10% of your capacity each way. It becomes a little bit too bumpy. Next question, true or false? Autoscaling impacts availability. False. If done correctly, it does not. At least we didn't see any indication that it does. What does impact availability, however, is under provisioning. So if you run your autoscaling groups under provisioned, there is a very good chance you will run into trouble. So I want to separate these two concerns. One concern is knowing your performance characteristics, is knowing the current capacity of an individual instance. It's knowing the sweet performance band where you can operate your servers. Regardless of whether you scale or not, you have to know it. Once you know it, you can use autoscaling to operate them in this band all the time. And I'll show you examples. A little bit, this slide is AWS specific. When people think about autoscaling, it's kind of like a black box. I wanted to show you what's inside that black box a little bit. There is two moving parts. One is CloudWatch, and another is the scaling group itself. So scaling CloudWatch alarm operates on a metric. It's actually aggregated metric. And you set the threshold, you set the number of evaluation periods that your metric have to exceed the threshold, then your ASG gets notification, then it executes the scaling action up or down, and you have to specify the amount of scaling and the cooldown or warm-up time. As you can see, there is a few, well, here there is at least 5 tunables. You have to pick them, you have to tune them, you have to monitor them. We'll see how it plays out later. And I'll also show you some examples of misconfiguration. What metric to scale on? That is the question. And actually, a lot of people, I worked with a lot of teams who asked the same question. It's more of, it basically comes down to the question, how do you measure your work? Some people measure work in distance traveled or the weight lifted or the number of widgets produced, while others tend to think about it in terms of how tired they are. So there is fundamentally 2 different ways of measuring your work. Throughput is a direct measure of your work. Measure how requests you processed, how many messages you got from SQS, something along those lines. Resource utilization is a measure, think of it as how tired you are. You can measure both, you can scale on both. There is, as usual, there is pros and cons. My personal preference is to scale on throughput because it's a very direct metric. At any given time, you can, once you know your band, your throughput per instance, you can very easily determine how many instances you need to accommodate incoming requests. The cons is that it tends to drift over time and it prompts to changes in your request mix. ASGs can process different kinds of requests, the same ASG. So that mix tends to drift over time and maybe during different hour of the day. So that affects scaling. Utilization metric is pretty simple. You set your target. You try to keep it on target. Say CPU utilization at 50%. Keep me there. What we noticed, though, utilization metrics tend to be more jittery and more noisy. And also, it's harder to reason about those metrics. Autoscaling on multiple metrics is what a lot of teams tried doing. It can be done. There disadvantages of it, or it's more, it could result in unpredictable scaling behavior. It's harder to reason about what would happen and how those different metrics would interplay with each other. You might get contradictory signals from different metrics. Your ASG start oscillating. Here at Netflix, we recommend the setup where you have a single scale-up policy on throughput, scale-down policy on throughput, and emergency scale-up on CPU. We call it the hammer rule. So if something happens, you get a spike of traffic, at least we scale you up quick on CPU. Okay, my favorite part, examples. So here we see a graph that represents the total volume of requests that we process versus the cluster size. This is our more or less standard pattern of traffic. This is real data, by the way, from one of our ASGs. So now you can see that our cluster size goes from maybe 50 to 350. That's 7x spread. That's pretty good. Wish they all scaled like this. You can also see that the shape of the cluster size line, the red line, it kind of matches the blue line, the blue area, which is also good. But this graph doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell you what exactly we scale on. Here. Now, these graphs are aligned in time, and the bottom graph represents our throughput per instance, and that is exactly the metric we scale on. We set the band. This is scale up, 110. Scale down, 90. We want to keep our throughput per instance in this band. Now see what happens. When our throughput is within the band, ASG size is flat. It's not scaling. As soon as we start bumping against the ceiling, it starts scaling up. The throughput goes down because we scale up, the throughput per instance. So we keep bumping against the ceiling through our peak, and then we start scaling down, and then we bump against the floor, and then we scale up, and that repeats. So this is the normal pattern of scaling. And next, we'll look at some examples of misconfigured scaling. No rush scaling. Okay. So from the top graph, you see right away that, well, the traffic, there is very significant peaks and troughs in the traffic. It's about 3x, right? But ASG doesn't scale. It doesn't follow that pattern. It stays between 300 and 400 instances. Also, if you look at throughput per instance, we cannot keep it within the band. It goes above. This is dangerous zone, by the way. So this is when you say, oh, autoscaling can affect my availability. Misconfigured autoscaling can affect your availability because you're consistently above your threshold. Well, and here, if you're below, capacity wasted. So, well, the problem here is that the scaling amount is too small. If we increase scaling amount, the cluster size would follow our traffic more closely. Next, twitchy scaling. Twitchy. So this is somewhat the opposite problem. Here, and actually, I spoke with the person who set it up, and he said, oh yeah, I was a little bit worried that we don't get enough capacity. So as soon as I reach my upper threshold, I'll just double up in size. No problem. So, well, kind of, sort of, it's no problem. It's fine. We're below our threshold. But what happens is we double up, and then the scale down policy kicks in, and it scales you down. And then within the band, we're not scaling, and it repeats. And it goes like this. So this is not necessarily a threat to your availability, but this is something that you should be aware of because, again, it's a waste of capacity, and it's just a capacity churn. Okay. Notice yellow and green lines, they are the same. By mistake, we configured our scale up and scale down thresholds to be the same. So ASG is confused, really. As soon as you scale up, you're crossing my scale down threshold, so I need to scale down. As soon as you scale down, well, the scale up threshold is crossed, so I need to scale up, and it keeps oscillating. So the only thing I guess that saves us here is that we scale up by 10% and scale down by 5%. That's why we're kind of following the traffic pattern. But this is bad. This is this constant churn of capacity. Okay. And this is the last slide. AWS released target tracking. No more of this setting up individual policies, scale up, scale down threshold. You can think of target tracking as a thermostat. You set the temperature, it keeps the temperature. Pick a metric, set a target value, warm-up time, you're all set. Here's an example. Regular AWS scaling policies, step scaling policies, target tracking. As you can see, it's much, much smoother. It's also easier to set up. It's also supported by Spinnaker, our development tool. This is the way to go. Thank you, guys. To you, Brandon.